Hey, No Fear listeners, Mel here. For 3 years, the No Fear cast has worked to bring you shows every 2 weeks. Right now, to celebrate our fourth season, we are releasing a few of our Patreon exclusive mini episodes. For just a few dollars a month, you can get a brand new show every week. You'll get exclusive access to episodes. Right now, if you become a Patreon contributor, there are over 70 episodes from our first 3 years waiting for you to enjoy. And we're just going to continue producing these. So please check us out on Patreon for more information. And as always, thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to a mini episode from the No Fear cast. As always, first of all, thank you so much for your support for this podcast. We really do appreciate it. And I feel like a broken record saying it, but it's true. We really do appreciate the financial support that you have been willing to give us for this show. For this week's episode, we thought that we'd do a companion piece to our main episode that was just released, and that episode is the episode about Plan 9 from Outer Space and its director Ed Wood. So we thought as the companion piece that we would focus this mini episode on the character of Vampira, who played a role in Plan 9 from Outer Space and many other things as well.
Yeah, today we're talking about Vampira, which, I almost said the character Vampira, which Vampira was a character, but she became so identified with the actress who played her, Mila Nurmi, that there was almost a period of time where it was hard to tell like where Nurmi and Vampira began. For instance, as Matt mentioned, she was in Plan 9 from Outer Space, and she was also credited as Vampira, her character in that movie. And as I'm sure we may even mention again later in the podcast, when she was doing her horror show, she would actually do publicity where she would go around in a car as if she was Vampira, just like going to the grocery store or something. And so like the lines between the character she created and Mila Nurmi were very thin. But just a little bit of background here on her before her pre-Vampira days. Nurmi lived from 1922 to 2008. She grew up in Oregon. She actually worked in a fish cannery at one point. And if you're interested in Vampira, I would suggest that you watch the documentary Vampira and Me, which came out in 2012, which has a lot of really interesting information on her and a lot of interview material with her where she actually tells her life story. Her mom was kind of formal, wanted to tamp down her dreams. When she was young, Nurmi heard Orson Welles on the radio and was like, I want to do that. I want to be an actor. I want to go to New York or Los Angeles. And her mom kind of said that wasn't possible for someone like her. And she kind of ended up making it happen. She moved to New York City. She tried her hand at work in theater, and she was discovered, she said, by Howard Hawks. This was like in 1945, and he invited her to come to the West Coast and possibly be doing movies. Of course, this was also around the time that he was working with Lauren Bacall, and Nurmi ended up not really getting any work at that point. And so from 48 to 51, she worked as a cheesecake model, which basically she was kind of a West Coast version. So she was a surfer girl. She was one of the top 10 pinups at the time. She didn't make a lot of money. And it was very much like what's the word I'm looking for? These kind of models were very, I guess, tame as to what you may be thinking in your head. She really was just kind of this blonde surfer girl type character in a bathing suit who would often be posing on beach settings. And she was influenced to start thinking about Vampira as a character when she won a costume party where she had worn a costume inspired by Charles Addams' New Yorker cartoons. Lisa, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the documentary about her, and I want to go ahead before I forget and mention that there is a biography that came out, I think, in 2014 by W. Scott Poole, and it's called Vampira, Dark Goddess of Horror. So that's going to be a good place if you want to read about her and her life, because as you'll find in this episode, her life was quite fascinating. But Mel, you were mentioning how she used to be a pinup model, and she is a natural blonde. She's of Finnish descent, which if you go and look up some of those pre-Vampira pictures of her, and they're a little bit hard to find because she is so associated with Vampira, but she's almost unrecognizable. because she does go, as you said, from this beach blonde surfer girl in a swimsuit on a beach to all black, sharp, talon-like nails on her finger, painted in the color she called hemorrhage red. She wore this very thick, like white pancake makeup. She painted on her eyebrows and had them in a very extreme arch. And she's most famous in the opening of her show for coming screaming out of white smoke. And of course, she's known for her figure as well. If you look at these pictures, it looks like someone's photoshopped her, because supposedly she had a figure, a 17-inch waist, so very tiny. But this is the character of Vampira, and she did create this in a way, as you mentioned, at a Halloween party. She had, you can kind of think of it as like Vampira Light, and that's where, at least when she was talking about Vampira later, she kind of points to the genesis. But in looking towards wanting to be an actress and wanting to be a performer, she actually tried out different characters, and none of them really stuck the way Vampira did. For instance, she had a character called Sister St. Francis that she was kind of toying around with before Vampira was born. But she basically was really interested in carnival sideshows, and she wanted to put forth this woman as a psychic and kind of interact with audiences in that way, and be again, maybe like a piece of performance art if we think about it. But she was also very interested in, I guess, the religious undertones of middle America, if you want to call it that. And that's where this Sister St. Francis, kind of melds into this religious psychic person that she was playing. I don't know too much more about that, because I don't think it ever went anywhere. I think it was just something she thought about. But she was always trying to come up with these characters. And at this Halloween party, I guess you could say Vampira was born, and she was discovered all at once. And that led to all sorts of meetings with producers. And from there, things started to move very quickly for what we know as a character of Vampira. And of course, she's most well known for her TV show, which I think first aired in 1954. But that only lasted for a year, but it made an absolute indelible mark on not only the culture of the time, but kind of pop culture going forward from that time period. She, during that same time, also was kind of famous for what she did after hours in Hollywood. Mel, as you mentioned, she would dress up as Vampira, going out not just on her show, but going out, and that was her persona. That was who she put on. And she became famous also for hanging around with people like James Dean and even Elvis. I think I saw somewhere that James Dean, before he really knew who she was, told the press that he believed she was a real-life sorceress, because he had really only seen her in this iteration. And of course, they met and they become really great friends. So yeah, she led an absolutely fascinating life. But I don't want to jump too far ahead. We probably need to spend some time talking about her show.
One thing I was thinking about while you were talking about the creation of her character is that the 17-inch waist, which is just crazy, looking. If you see, there's not actually much. There's not much surviving of her being Vampira, because her show just went straight live. There wasn't really any recording of it. But I mean, you can see her appearing on various late night shows, and I think doing a commercial. But she talked in one of the interviews that I watched about how she created those dimensions, and in order to keep her waist, not to keep it that way, but to get her waist to the 17 inches she needed for a show, she would go through 2 days of fasting, she would dehydrate herself through being in steam bath and not drinking anything along with her not eating. Then she made this mix of papyra powder and cold cream that she would put all around her waist. And then she would wrap her middle section in an inner tube in order to make her sweat profusely. And that was how, every week when she was doing Vampira, 2 days before she did it, that's how she would prepare. And then she would, come off her fast afterward, which to me, doing that was almost as terrifying as the character she created. I mean, talk about like punishing your body for your job,
I mean, that is absolutely insane, but it also kind of goes to show you how not only dedicated she was, but really how smart she was in creating this character, because you've got to remember this was in 1954, and we've talked about 1950s America a little bit, and especially in some of our nuclear war and sci-fi episodes in the past where we've talked about, what was happening in America at the time and the fears. But there was also this idea of femininity and of who a woman was supposed to be. And she took that idea of housewife and mother and kind of this perfect woman and really exaggerated it, because she talked about wanting to, if you look at it, I think, and I would never just fixate on somebody's bodily dimensions, but for Vampira, I think it's appropriate. But I think she was something like 36, 17, 36. And so she really wanted to sculpt her body into this very exaggerated, what was considered, I guess, the ideal of what would have been sexy. And that, I think, was really revolutionary for her, because there had been people, and Mel, you mentioned the TV appearances. I think she appeared on a few shows with like Bela Lugosi and those people, the kind of Hammer horror boys, I guess you could say. And so she was definitely connected to that community, but she was the first one who really combined, I think, the idea of sex and the idea of death. The idea of horror, and really melded them in a way that I think made people uncomfortable, but at the same time really enticed them and really drew them in. And that was part of the appeal, and I think why she has lasted for so long as far as like a cult figure, because she really was making a commentary on American society at the time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at her, in a lot of ways, she is just exuberant Gothic parody of woman's body image at the time. From her actual physical portrayal, and I mean, even her scream. I mean, she talked later about how the scream was meant to imply sex in addition to like fear. And it's also amusing because she's screaming, but she's in control the whole time. She even wanted to make fun of the shows that were on TV for women at the time. So she started doing recipe skits where she would teach people how to make like cocktails, that had bugs or blood or something in them, And I think it's just so interesting how she turns what we stereotypically think of as this 1950s nuclear family mom kind of in the kitchen thing on its head, just completely. And there's kind of this, I think there's a draw, like people were drawn to that idea of female, I don't know if you call it, I mean, I guess you call it female strength in a way. I mean, she was a local show that was only seen by folks who were watching like KBC Channel 7 on the West Coast. And yet she was in Life magazine. She was on these national late night shows. She became a cultural phenomenon when she literally was just like, when you live somewhere and late at night, there's the woman or the guy who hosts a little horror show and you watch it and you think you're the only person in that particular tri-state area that knows about that person. She actually became a national figure. And I just think it's so interesting because other people tried to do takes on what she was doing. For instance, Grace Paul, I believe her name was, did a similar late night show for romance movies, and she called herself Voluptua, and she played up this like really like wearing like flowy clothing and laying on a bed and acting like she was getting undressed and whatever. Those were her skits like between the thing, and the show didn't take. I think she was only on for maybe just a few movies, basically just a few months. But I mean, Vampira show didn't go on forever. She unfortunately was only on for a couple years. But I do think it's interesting that her show kind of became nationally popular and survived, whereas other kind of takeoff shows stayed local market or didn't even really do anything.
Yeah, it is interesting how quickly she became an icon, because it wasn't something that happened after the fact. It was something that was happening while she was on the air. But at the same time, she was making a commentary on, 1950s feminism, I guess, or women's roles. And there was a definite backlash, I think, because of that. Part of it was her show getting canceled. I believe she had several FCC warnings. I'm not entirely sure what they were, but I can guess. A woman in a tight dress showing off her breast, screaming orgasmically at the beginning of every horror movie. I mean,
I don't know why they complain about that.
That was a lot for 1954. But she suffered a lawsuit. And again, I don't know all the details on it, but I know that some young starlet thought that she was defamed in some way because of her, and she was suffering the end of her marriage. And then there was the death of her friend James Dean, and the tabloids were kind of rotten to her because they said erroneously that her and Dean had been a romantic couple and he had broken it off with her. And so she had cursed him, kind of taking on this whole role of like a sorceress or witch or, and that was the cause of his death, which is something really horrible if your friend has passed away and people are writing this stuff about you. And it's strange to me how quickly she did become an icon and then how quickly people turned against her once her show was canceled and once kind of everything went away. Although she did continue to appear as Vampira. We mentioned Plan 9, the Ed Wood movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and that was in 1959. So that was only maybe 4 years after her show was canceled. But she also appeared as herself in Las Vegas in a Liberace show. And she became, I guess, kind of a fixture in the 1980s in like the punk movement of Hollywood. And she became famous for her association, I guess is the best word, with the band The Misfits. That all being said, I think she did what she could to keep Vampira alive. I think at one point she ran an antique shop on Melrose Avenue that was in the 1960s called Vampira's Attic. And, so she was quite willing to accept the role that she had created and kind of keep it going. But I think there were also rumors circulating that because she didn't make a whole lot of money doing the show, so she had to continue working afterwards, that she had gone into the pornography business, which none of that was true. But again, I think these kind of rumors persisted because people weren't entirely comfortable with someone who wore sex so brazenly, especially in connection with death.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, one of the things that I saw a couple times when I was doing, reading for this episode and in the documentary is the way that the press portrayed her. And you mentioned that with James Dean, how the tabloids kind of jumped on it and this idea of her cursing him or being bad luck. And yes, I mean, she at several points in her life claimed that she had psychic powers and these sorts of things. But there's still this exaggerated tabloid-esque creating stories that made some of the James Dean fans extremely angry with her. And she also would get bad press, I think, based on exactly what you're saying, Lisa, that her portrayal, I think it was 1955, she was terrorized in public, attacked basically by a fan. She had stalkers. And when there would be newspaper articles about this, usually there was kind of a flippant tone to it, almost like it's like not taken seriously or part of the Vampira shtick or something. And even if she was riding around a car or hearse as Vampira, you know, there is absolutely no reason for her to have to fear for her safety. But I think in some ways she was seen as kind of this counterculture, not serious, sadly inviting these things upon herself rather than viewing her as an individual. And I think part of that kind of played a role in her not being able to get past that Vampira role. As you mentioned, like toward the end of her life, at one point she was working in a restaurant in exchange for food. At one point she was installing linoleum and doing some small carpentry and craft work in people's homes. And so I think that those two aspects of her life, like one, her inability to keep Vampira going or move on to something different after Vampira when all she wanted her whole life was to be an actress. And the flip side is what tabloids did to her because, like you're saying, Lisa, that reaction to her character. I mean, those are two kind of tragic aspects to her life.
Yeah, but, you know, she is, as we said, she's an icon now. And so at least what she has created will last. And I'll just end with one final note. Several times during this episode, I have struggled not to say the word Elvira for Vampira because those two are closely related. And I'm really looking forward to in a future episode kind of discussing Elvira. But one interesting fact is in 1989, Vampira did sue Elvira over the character. In fact, she went as far as to say there is no Elvira, there is only a pirated Vampira. I think it was a $10 million lawsuit that she lost, which is again kind of it's a sad ending, I think, to a beloved character, but it also shows how willing she was to fight for something that she had created, and in this case, she felt like it was being pirated. Hopefully, in the Elvira episode, we can talk about that a little bit more and really kind of go into the ins and outs about why, at least I don't believe it was pirated. I'm just going to throw that in there in case in any time in the past in this episode, you've heard me say Elvira instead.
I didn't hear it, but I can totally understand why you would have trouble keeping the two separate.